Yeah. After 6, so we might as well get started. Good evening and welcome everybody to this event of the German-British Society, Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. And as has become custom now, we always try to provide a sort of debrief of the last Königswinter Conference so that members and friends can see what happened. Königswinter Conference should have taken place in the summer, but had to be postponed because of the general election in the UK. And so it was now held on October 29th and 30th. And it was moved from Manchester, where it would have been held if it had been in the summer, to London. And it was shortened a bit, so it was just slightly sort of unusual. For the second time, incidentally, because the last time it was supposed to be, or it did happen in the UK, it should have been in September, and Queen Elizabeth died, so it had to be postponed. And yeah, so this has now happened twice. Anyway, we have two wonderful panelists who will tell us what their impression was, and I'm very grateful to both of them that they've made it. Just a few household remarks. This session is being recorded so that you and other people can watch it later. Number two, if you do want to join the conversation, if you have questions, please just put your question in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go along. And number three, kindly mute your microphone if you're not actually speaking, but you're invited to keep the camera on so we can see you and you can see us. So we should be able to manage. And if you find it's not really working, then you can still turn your camera off. Anyway, a great welcome to Baroness Smith of Newnham, Julie Smith, and to Dr. Wiebke Winter, member of the Parliament of Bremen, who are going to tell us what they experienced at the Königswinter Conference, and we'll get into a conversation about it very soon. It was actually the 74th conference, so it's really been going for a very long time. And we'll come back to that particular issue as we go along. Just to sort of run down the sort of formalities, the conference consisted of an opening session, 4 plenary sessions, an evening reception, 1 breakout with 4 breakout groups, and then a closing at the very end. And it went from 2 to 6:30 on the October 29th, and then from 8:30 to 4:45 on October 30th. The evening reception was hosted by the German ambassador at, not at the embassy because that's being refurbished, but at the, what is it called? Germany House or something, yes. Anyway, so let's get into it. Oh, just one remark, obviously we always have quite a number of politicians at the conference, and the sort of top politicians this time was the Minister for Europe and the Americas, which is a wonderful big title, from the UK, and a Minister of State from the German Foreign Office. We've had more sort of prominent politicians on occasion, but in London, I think we did experience that we had a very good discussion with the politicians that were there. So, without further ado, Julie, would you like to start off and just give us some impressions? What did you think of it?
Thank you. I am a Königswinter virgin. It's the first time that I had attended the grown-up Königswinter conference. I went to young Königswinter back in the day when I was young, which goes
Very
all the
good.
way back to 1994. So it took me quite a long time to graduate to attend this time. And I was invited somewhat at the last minute, so I only attended part of the conference. And I think one of the issues is location, because in many ways, having an event in central London means that the British participants come and go. And so if we can have an event where we've taken everybody away from their home base, that often I think means there's a little bit more continuity of attendance. But obviously the timing of this 74th Königswinter was very significant. And I get the sense in some ways that a resetting of relations between the UK and the European Union and the UK and Germany is something that is probably hitting our headlines a little bit more than it is in Germany. That the new British government elected on the 4th of July very much wants to be talking about the new relationships. And so the Minister for Europe and the Americas is responsible for the UK's bilateral relations with Europe. There is also a Minister of State in the Cabinet Office who is responsible for UK-EU relations. But the fact that the minister came and I think spoke from the heart, as I've heard him do before, and I say this not, so I'm a Liberal Democrat. The government is obviously a very solid Labour majority government, but I have a lot of respect for the minister, and I think he really spoke from the heart. And there was good engagement both with him, but also the Minister of State for the Armed Forces spoke on the panel that I moderated. And again, we had a really good discussion from ministers from both sides, but also from industry. And I think we could really, particularly on the defence and foreign policy side, see the areas where there is a lot of scope for cooperation, where the UK, Germany and industry, and particularly industries with a base in Germany and the UK, can really see a way of working together. That obviously leaves us with a bit of an issue because, as we keep hearing, the reset doesn't involve rejoining the single market. And so from the British side, we have, I think, a desire to rebuild the relations, both the bilateral with Germany and the wider EU relations. But one of the issues that remains open is our lack of membership of the single market. I think the defence and foreign policy session was among the most constructive. I think the environmental session, which I'm sure Wiebke is going to talk about because that's the one she spoke in, was also very positive. The other sessions were absolutely fascinating, but the Wort des Jahres appears to be something that I hadn't heard before, spicy. To me, the word spicy is something that only relates to food. Something might be piquant, it's spicy. But it's come to be used for a debate that is very heated. And a couple of the presentations on the economic side and the demographic side were both quite heated. So there was a lot of passion in the room, but I wasn't quite sure that the interlocutors actually had as much interaction as one might have hoped, because the point shouldn't just be to say what the world looks like from our own perspective, but to engage a little bit more. So I thought some of the sessions worked well and others a little bit more engagement, perhaps from the British side, might have led to a more engaged discussion. So it was interesting. I think there was a lot of opportunity for discussion, but perhaps some of the contributors wanted to be heard rather than to listen. Maybe I'm being slightly too critical. Wiebke and others might have slightly different perspectives, but they were my sort of initial impressions.
Well, thank you. Yes, I suppose wanting to be heard rather than to listen is something that is in fashion with all politicians at the moment, perhaps more than it used to be. And so over to a young politician who not only had a role, sort of preconceived role, but also had to suddenly assume another role during the conference because one of the panelists had dropped out. So there she was. So Wiebke, tell us, what was your impression?
Thank you so much, Rupert. So hi, everyone. I'm a little bit COVID-ridden still, so please excuse me if I'm looking for a word in English, as I'm one of the Germans and therefore not a native speaker. It was my first time at Königswinter also, and I really enjoyed taking part in the conversation in the conference. I went there and I was very excited and a little bit nervous about what would happen there because I wasn't familiar with the format. I've already attended several other international conferences, but this is a rather small conference on an international level. And I think that this is also one of the beauties of the conference, because you're really able, if you want to speak to almost everybody who's taking part, especially because there are also many tea breaks. And I love that you get tea that is actual tea, because you're in Britain, because when you're in Germany, usually you get only very weak tea. And that was great for conversations, for exchange. And I think it happened at a point of time where we weren't aware of how important this conference would be, because shortly afterwards, we just heard it took place on the 29th and the 30th of October, and the 6th of November was a day which was not only important to many of our friends from the other side of the Atlantic, but also for us in Germany, because our government decided to collapse on the day that Donald Trump was re-elected as president of the United States. And I think this incident, and now that we have to wait for another round of elections and everything that has happened in France as well, shows that we need to stick closer together in Europe, and not only in the European Union. And then it's ever more important that there are also strong German-British relations, because at the moment, Great Britain is one of the few bigger countries, together with Poland, that are actually able to act on many issues, like the war of the Russian war in Ukraine, or also the conflict that we are seeing in Israel and everything that's happening in Syria at the moment. And I think that this was really good, because we were able to discuss it without knowing what would be happening, and building that relationship before we even know how important it might become, or is right now. But of course, we were aware that there was a possibility that Trump would be re-elected, and what that would mean also for us in Europe, and that we need to stick closer together, especially with regards to the security panel that Julie just mentioned. And I think that we also talked about the most important topics of our time. So we started with an economic panel, where we talked a lot about also how's the younger generation facing all the challenges that are coming. I think that was really interesting to see also the perspective of somebody who's also teaching younger people. And I thought that, yeah, so I'm from the CDU, I'm from the Conservative Party, so I'm used to an age ratio where younger people are slightly underrepresented. But I think that there were many young people also at this Königswinter Conference, and I thought that this was really great, because I think we had a great mixture. And it was an interesting debate to listen to that. And of course, we also talked about security, and Julie just touched upon that, so I'll keep it short. And then we talked about energy, which I thought was really interesting from a German perspective, because we talked so much about nuclear. And of course, as a Christian Democrat, I'm also used to talk about nuclear power, because that's something we talk about, but we're just not really seen as feasible anymore in Germany. And I thought it was interesting on how different the perspectives are on nuclear power, and how we should use it, and how we can really arrange for the whole world to become climate neutral, and how important it is. And I was positively surprised that there wasn't a real debate, or there was no debate about how or if we should become climate neutral, but rather how, and what also the Trump election would mean for that. And then we also talked about the labor market, which I think is really important. Also, always speaking from the younger generation point of view, where I would, of course, wish for a closer connection between UK and the European Union, especially Germany. I was one of the lucky ones and the last ones in 2015 who were able to do a year, or at least part of a year, abroad in the UK as an exchange student. But now to work in the UK is almost impossible if you don't have citizenship in the UK. And I think that this was also an interesting debate, also to see how migration is perceived in the different aspects of Germany being a country in the middle of the European Union. Me, especially from a city-state of Bremen, where many migrants like to travel to, because we are seen as very migration friendly, and we actually are when you look at the numbers. And then the UK, I'm not a British citizen, so please correct me, but who have also decided, or the majority, unfortunately, from my perspective, has decided to get out of the European Union because of migration. And I think that this was also very interesting. So I think that it's really important to still keep in touch. And I did that with many participants afterwards, after the conference. I already had several Zoom calls, and I think that this also shows how effective the Königswinter Conference is. Because you get new perspectives, you think out of the box, you get the policy which you think is so obvious in your own country gets challenged, and I think that helps us tremendously in order to build better policy, and especially to raise to the challenges that we are now facing with the re-election of Trump and everything else that's happening in the world.
Yeah, thank you, Wiebke. Yes, I mean, let's just sort of get that out of the way. Donald Trump was the elephant in the room. I mean, you know, we were always coming back to Donald Trump because you said absolutely rightly that it was just a few days before the election. Everybody at that point was not quite sure how it would go, but one sort of dreaded it would go the way it did go. And so, yes, there it was. But let me shift to another point you just made and ask Julie, and addressing her rather more as an academic than as a politician, the defense issue. I think that is a hugely important issue we need to address. And my feeling is, and this came out in the discussion in London, that the Germans at the conference were sort of circling round the cold water and not actually jumping in, because quite obviously we do need a new security arrangement. And while on a whole range of other issues, we can always say, well, that's Brussels, and you know, we need really, well, it won't work with security issues. I think it'll be, and there has been a conference since with the foreign ministers of UK, France, Italy, Poland, and Germany. It will be those five, and possibly Spain as well, who will have to do something about it. So, Julie, do you think that will happen? Do you think we will have and drawing on what was discussed in London, do you think there will be a sort of totally new security arrangement?
So I think there are all sorts of tentative initiatives, and I think one of the things that the new government is really clear about is that there is an open area for discussion and the UK to become re-engaged with Europe. And that is obviously on the defence and security side of things. Had Theresa May stayed in office, she was negotiating a UK-EU security agreement. That disappeared under Boris Johnson. Last year, Julian King, the last UK European Commissioner, but he had had the security portfolio, drafted a paper on UK-EU security relations, and David Lammy has very much bought into that. So I think there's a sort of twin track approach at the moment of the UK saying we want to look at a UK-EU relationship, and Keir Starmer is going to a meeting, I think, of the European Council in Brussels in February. But at the same time, the UK is trying to strengthen a whole series of bilateral relations. We've already had the Trinity House Agreement, which was very welcome. The government is talking about strengthening the Lancaster House Agreement, which we have with France. And it's already signed agreements with Estonia and Romania. So not two of the countries you've just mentioned, Rupert, but two of the countries where, as NATO members, we feel there's an interest. The other country where I think the UK is looking for stronger relations is Sweden, because there is a defence industrial interest there. And I think one of the issues that we all need to think about is not just what's happening at the political level and the strategic level, but also to what extent can we manage interoperability? What are we doing about joint procurement? How far are we really creating an effective European defence industrial base? And there is a common interest in doing that. The problem is the United States, because at the moment, what we're not really sure about is, where is Donald Trump going? That this morning or yesterday, there was speculation that somehow he's going to go cold on AUKUS, the nuclear arrangement that the UK has with Australia and the UK under the Biden administration. And if that disappears, that might be better for the UK's relations with Europe, but equally, it might leave us with some holes in our defence industry. So there are some real questions about where the United States is going and whether that forces the UK much more closely back to security relations with our European neighbours. I think it's still quite difficult to see the European Union suddenly saying, let's have a new treaty, let's have treaty reform, because that still requires unanimity at 27. So that idea that you put forward, Rupert, of, well, maybe it's the big 3, 5, 6 cooperating outside of a treaty framework might be the appropriate, or outside of the EU framework might be the way forward, because after all, that's how we did Schengen. The Eurozone still is smaller than the EU. So having an organisation that includes some EU member states and the UK would, I think, be acceptable even to Eurosceptics in the UK, because they'd say it's not the EU and we've done it by choice. And it might enable us then to begin to rebuild relations with our most important European partners.
Yeah. Wiebke, would you like to add to that?
I'm not a security expert, so I feel that Julie is much more qualified than me to talk about it. But I think what was also mirrored in the discussion, from what I see in Germany, is that we aren't quite sure what to do in Germany. That we have this huge debate going on because there is this huge movement, and my parents and grandparents were also one of them. So I have this feeling in my family too that we always wanted just peace, and that we Germans are very much afraid to get in the middle of another war, and therefore we are always a little bit more not skeptical, but we don't want to force it. And I think right now also with the elections now coming up, this will always also be a big issue, especially now with Trump in the mix. But I thought that this was also mirrored very well. And for me, at least, it was also great to hear the different perspectives, because usually, especially in my politician world, we talk a lot to other politicians and members of the academia from other EU countries, but we don't get the chance that often to speak to people from the UK. And I think that this was also very interesting, especially as the UK also gives, for example, the Taurus equivalent to Ukraine, if I'm rightly informed.
I mean, there was another sort of little elephant in the room, in a way, in London, and that was Viktor Orban, who's been trying to block all kinds of EU decisions, and this is, of course, has made people rethink the whole issue of an EU-based security arrangement. You know, what's going to happen if we have to make a decision very quickly, and And we have one member state like Hungary, or I don't know, any other small country that sort of just blocks it, and this is made people think. But of course, Germany doesn't really want to be the one to sort of suggest these kind of things, because Germany is trying to be a good boy in Europe. But I mean, compared to Viktor Orban, even Margaret Thatcher was a pretty good girl in Brussels. I mean, I didn't say Boris Johnson, actually, no. But anyway, okay. So yes, does anybody want to add to this, to the security issue? But I think you all realize that that was a very important point, both in the formal sessions and sort of in talking to other delegates. We have something in the chat from Peter Brock, who says, thanks a lot to the rapporteurs and all. I could only listen in for a moment, but he only says he's only wishing us a Merry Christmas. So no, I thought it was a very learned remark from Peter Brock, but it's not actually. Okay. So anybody else who wants to come in on this sort of security issue? Oh yes. What about NATO? There's Dr. Angela Stoß says, what about NATO? Yeah. Did NATO come into the discussion?
From a British side, inevitably, because there is very much a sense that this government is saying North Atlantic first. Not completely saying we don't have any global role, because it's keeping the AUKUS arrangement, but not the Boris Johnson rhetoric of being east of Suez and being a global player. So I think there's a little bit of a sense in the UK of a renewed acknowledgement that maybe we aren't the global power that some would like us to be.
Yeah.
And also, I think I have a sense of déjà vu of the days of Tony Blair and New Labour, when there was very much a sense of, yes, we want to strengthen our European ties over defence, but it's not as an end in itself, it's as part of being a strong player in NATO. And so I think that's where the UK currently is. And it leaves that sense of, well, if Trump really does walk away from NATO, then we've strengthened the European security dimension.
Yeah. I sort of remember hearing more about Five Eyes and things at previous Königswinter conferences, and not much, if anything, this time. So yeah,
that's right.
There's definitely a sort of reshuffle of political outlook. Right. What other subjects did you find particularly striking or interesting or amazing? Or
one issue that I think is important is we've had the Trinity House Agreement. We have a prospect, a promise of a new British-German treaty,
which unfortunately is now being halted from the German side because of the elections that are coming up. Yeah.
Right. So that hadn't been reported this end, but that is unfortunate, but it picks up the point I was going to raise, that what we've seen recently has been the relationship between Starmer and Scholz, and a sense that the SPD and the Labour Party have been working closely together. I've also had a bit of a sense that the Labour Party has been doing or thinking a bit like David Cameron, trying to work with Angela Merkel, that somehow if we can work with Germany and get a good relationship with Germany, that's going to get us further with our other European neighbours, without realising that Germany is so completely wedded to the European Union that those bilateral relations in themselves are important, but they're not going to deliver necessarily what our prime ministers want. But my question was really going to be, because obviously Wiebke was there from the CDU, we had various Conservatives in the room, certainly former MPs. But to what extent do we feel that our politicians are speaking to each other beyond party lines? Because obviously the Liberal Democrats are talking to the FDP, CDU, I'm sure, are still talking to the Conservatives, but the Conservatives in lots of ways, you know, the Adenauer-Stiftung for quite a long time had questions about who do we really talk to, because so much of the Conservative Party really wasn't an effective sister party of the CDU. But if Friedrich Merz is going to be the next Chancellor, are there behind the scenes discussions? Can we be hoping that we can get beyond the party political? Because wearing my academic hat, my view is very much that a strong British-German relationship is important, regardless of who is Chancellor and who is Prime Minister.
My feeling is that sympathy and common views are very much across party lines. I don't think the Lib Dems would have very much in common with the Liberal Party in Germany at the moment. The CDU definitely had very little in common with the anyway, not with the Brexiteer side of the Conservative Party, and so on. I mean, you can go on and on about this. I think it's very much across party lines, and of course, I mean, the SPD-led German government, of course, knew that Starmer was coming in, and now, of course, Starmer knows very well that the SPD government is probably going out. So it will always have to be an arrangement across party lines.
If I may add to that, I think first of all, of course, it's easier if you have known each other for a longer time and then you both find yourselves in offices, because especially when you've been in politics for a long time, as Friedrich Merz also has been, you might know people from the EPP, so our European family group. Of course, that was always, or at least I don't know when the Tories decided to build their own political group. I think they were in the EPP, but that was before I can remember. I think that this always helps, but that was never the point with the Tories. Of course, there have been relationships between the CDU and the Tories. I can talk about this myself because I've founded the Klimaunion, a group that advocates more ambitious climate policies, and of course we look towards the Tories because they were always very environmentally friendly, and they have a sort of Klimaunion, the Conservative Environmental Network, that we talk to, and that is a great exchange. But I think for us in Germany, it's maybe a little more common, or at least that's what I can imagine, for us to talk beyond party lines, because we always have to form coalitions when we are in government. And even though it looks at the moment like Friedrich Merz will become Chancellor, there is still very high, it's very probable that there will also that the Social Democrats will also be in the government after the elections, because there might be what we call a great or a big coalition in Germany after the elections. If there are options also to go with the Greens, but let's see how the numbers turn out. And I think that this also helps. And I just recently, because as I just said, I'm still at home. I had a lot of time to read because I had COVID. And when I read the biography of Angela Merkel, what struck me was that I had the feeling, but she would know better than me, that she got along with Hollande very well. Whereas I think that Sarkozy, even though he was from the same party family, was a little bit more difficult. So I think it's always also about personal relationships, and I think what will help with Friedrich Merz is that he's a great transatlantic person. He was always, and I think it is the Atlantikbrücke, Atlantikbrücke. Thank you. And I think that he has also very close relationships, or a very close relationship, therefore, to the UK, and that will also help the German-British relationships if he's elected as Chancellor.
Yeah. Just on one other point you made a little earlier, during the years between, say, the referendum and the actual leave, at each and every Königswinter Conference, UK delegates would come up to German delegates sort of during coffee break, at the bar, and so on, and sort of say, you know, couldn't we have a sort of special arrangement between the UK and Germany? And whether we were government or parliament or citizens like myself, we had to say, no, very sorry, but you have to talk to Brussels. Now, of course, there are issues that we can talk about bilaterally. I mean, sort of real issues, but these sort of initiatives have sort of died out. I mean, we didn't have anybody coming up because I mean, you know, everybody knows there will be an agreement between UK and Germany, so nobody came up and said, you know, shouldn't we have one? Because it's just a fact. But it's sort of amusing that these sort of sidling up to one, that's more or less stopped. So,
I am being slightly naughty with a sense of schadenfreude. Of course, the nemesis for the British negotiators was one Monsieur Barnier, who is no longer the Prime Minister of France. So things seem to rattle round very quickly these days. That we had our snap election on the 4th of July. We've got or slightly early German elections. We've got the return of Trump, and we've got chaos in France. So all of that does leave the way open for quite different discussions from recent years.
And we've got a few other major problems we need to cope with, and we need to cope with together. Absolutely. There's one interesting remark in the chat. We sort of slightly moved away from the defense issues, but if you want to just see what it is, and if you want to comment, please do. I won't read it out because it's quite a long one, but you can have.
So it's a very helpful comment from Emanuele about defence expenditure, the aggregate of British and EU defence expenditure versus that of Russia. But the fact that basically we're outgunned despite spending so much more, and do Europeans understand that it's a lack of integrated procurement, etc., etc. And I think the straightforward answer is objectively, Europeans, leaders, defence ministers, academics, and the military understand the problems. And at times you can get an agreement to say, we should be doing all of this. We should have a common defence industrial base. We really need proper interoperability. But then when you get down to the detail and who's letting the contracts, we seem to default back to national procurement, national decisions. And unfortunately, we don't seem yet to have been shocked into making the transformational change that we need to do to be able to punch above our weight rather than being less than the sum of our parts.
The punching above one's weight was a phrase that came into the discussion quite often in London. Yes.
It's a very British approach.
Yeah, absolutely. But it sort of came in quite a lot, actually. Yes. Okay. What I'd like to do is change the subject. I think we've sort of more or less covered this sort of very important and discussion on defense and things. Complete change of subject. What people did discuss during tea breaks and so on, and a lot of people came up to me and wanted to know what I felt about it. So now I'm asking you what you feel about it. Do we need to change the format of the conference? I mean, it was the 74th conference. It's been more or less the same since the beginning, and we have Elke Berger here in the audience, who was the manager for many years and organized these conferences. And this time, for the first time, really, quite a lot of people sort of felt, are we still on the right track? Should we have some changes? Do you have a take on that, both of you?
Well, I think so. It was my first conference, so I don't really have like many Königswinter conferences to compare it to. But I thought, especially as a newbie there, that I would have liked. I don't know if that's maybe too special or too woo or something. But I would have liked to meet people more easily. So I think as a politician, I'm used to go to people that I don't know and introduce myself. But I think it would have been nice if I had gotten to know the people maybe in another format. That I always sat there with we had a list of participants and always looking, okay, this is him and this is her and what is she doing, and Googling them, and okay, what could I ask them and what is their special field of expertise. And of course, I'm aware that that would also need some time, but I think that this would be very interesting just because I feel that you bring together so many very senior and interesting people that it would be great to just know them, because maybe this is something that you expect and I just shown that I haven't done it, but I haven't Googled everyone beforehand and learned every name by heart. And I think that would have been a great experience, because I was amazed by how long lasting these contacts are. As I just mentioned, I was in contact with rather many people after the conference too, and I think that this is great. And apart from that, I think it's good that we have so many breaks that you also have time to network, because of course it's very interesting to follow the discussions, but I think the beauty and the magic can also happen in between the breaks.
Julia, do you have a take on that?
Yes, I pretty well agree.
Yeah.
Well, I pretty well agree with Wiebke. I thought one thing that was noticeable, particularly when I didn't, with the first session when I was, or second session, when I was at the front of the room moderating, I was aware that only one woman put her hand up to raise a question. And she was initially a little bit grumpy because I didn't immediately call her, and eventually I took her out of order because she was the only woman who put her hand up. And I think a little bit of maybe a refreshment of participants, and that there were quite a lot of it was quite male dominated, if I'm being direct. So the fact you have two women parliamentarians speaking now is slightly unrepresentative. I think Wiebke's right, there were a few younger women, and then there was quite a big gap. So a little bit more diversity might not be a bad thing. But the format was very similar to young Königswinter 30 years ago, having the plenaries and the breakouts. And in lots of ways, there are good reasons for doing that. But finding a way of, yes, having the informal interactions, I think might be the bit that's missing. But that's partly because it was so short that if you've got people staying for 2 nights and maybe there is a dinner and you move, there are a few more opportunities of talking to people, whereas effectively 24 hours, you don't quite have that opportunity. And what's the purpose? Some of it's to exchange ideas, but an awful lot of it is to exchange business cards, to make those contacts, to do the networking, and ensure that it's not simply 50 people who will meet each other at every Königswinter, but people who will be exchanging and then continuing to meet between Königswinters, and maybe a little bit more rotation.
Yeah, good point. I mean, we're having quite a big discussion, and incidentally, there's quite a noticeable difference of opinion between the UK Königswinter Steering Committee and us on the German side. So, I mean, we'll come up with something, but it's it's a discussion that's sort of going on at the moment. I definitely don't want to see Königswinter getting into, what a lot of conferences now do, sort of people sticking pieces of paper on the wall and things like that. We definitely don't want to see that happening. But we probably do have to make some. And somebody said, a journalist said, you'll have to choose. You can either have Chatham House Rule, then you'll get very little media attention because there's nothing to report. Or you have sort of an open session where people can say, Minister so-and-so said such and such.
And that's one of the things feeding back now, because there are a few things that we could say, but one of the speakers in particular, one of the British speakers, kept saying, this is the Chatham House Rule, isn't it? This is the Chatham House Rule.
Yeah.
And what that person was saying was something that was really quite powerful and unexpected. It wasn't a politician, but then if we hadn't been under the Chatham House Rule, that person may not have spoken at all. If they had spoken, they would have been much more restrained.
That's why we've always had it for as long as I can remember. That's quite a while now. We've always had Chatham House Rule. But somehow it made sense when the journalist said yes, but then it'll be very difficult to get into the media because you can't attribute.
Would it be possible though to have something, and obviously because arrangements have kept being changed because of the unexpected, the Queen, the government, and so on, but if things could be planned, if the two foreign ministers, we obviously had David Lammy doing a pre-record, but if the two foreign ministers or the two defence ministers were able to be present, that would be public, that would be open, because if you think about it, Chatham House does do quite a good job of capturing some really high-level speakers and making them available. Yeah,
that's definitely one of the ideas that's being sort of thought through, whether we should have a sort of public part and a Chatham House Rule part, so that it would probably make politicians come more readily if that's what politicians are like, aren't they, Wiebke?
Well, I think for us it's always refreshing not to have to speak in a certain way, and that if we know that journalists are around, every sentence needs to be as such that it can be printed and that you won't get a shitstorm at home. And I thought that it was really interesting that we had these Chatham House Rules, because I thought, okay, now I can really learn something and not just have like a bingo card on my seat and get the usual phrases out there. But I think if a mixture is needed also to maybe raise more attention, I think that would be a good idea if you have like high-level speakers and you can open it a little bit. I mean, we are doing in Germany, what is quite common for us is that we need to accept what is written about us in the papers, especially if we have direct citations. I can always say, oh no, I don't want to be cited, want to have a citation in that way, or I want to alter it. Of course, you always need to trust the journalists that they do it in that way, but I think Chatham House Rules are also based on trust, and that has worked quite well. And I think if one could maybe do a session and then also have maybe the alteration there that you really have to ask whether you can citate them in a certain way or not, that might be an idea.
Yeah, thank you. Any other comments from the audience? Mari, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking, because we talked about the security aspect quite a bit, but maybe Wiebke could also give us some of her impressions on the climate session that she was a part of, just because she already said this is her background, and also because this might, be an interesting topic of collaboration between the two countries as well.
Yes, thank you, Marie. I think what is interesting about the special relation is the point that I've already mentioned, that UK always was very, and is environmentally friendly. And especially when I now look at the Tories, of course, I hope that it will stay that way, as I've seen that especially now the conflict that's sometimes talked about between the economy and the environment is now also made partly in the UK, and it's certainly made in some ways also in Germany, where we ask, okay, can we keep our industry and become climate neutral at the same time? And I'm quite certain that we can. I think that we need to be optimistic about it. And that many numbers have already shown that we can, especially because our economic growth has been steady since the 1990s, even though we have decarbonized a lot since then. But of course, it's very difficult to do it, especially in an international environment, with all the questions that were also raised at COP, which also was held after Königswinter Conference, and which has also showed that it's very difficult to agree on payments, who needs to pay, who doesn't. And I think that it's important that the European Union and the UK pull together one string, because we see that we have a lot of opponents right now, and we also see that India and China are doing quite well, but what can we do to incentivize them even more? And how can we still protect our own economy and our own industry? And I think that these are questions that we need to address more thoroughly, especially now with the tariffs and CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism from EU, which, as far as I know, also will affect UK, and how we can get to a global pricing system. And I think that we need to talk more about the idea of a climate club that Olaf Scholz has made, especially in the G7. And I think that was a great starting point, but we need to have more conversations, because we see that there is more and more resistance also to becoming climate neutral in certain countries at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Julie, anything to add to that?
No, I think what Wiebke said is absolutely right.
Very good. I think, yes, our time is up. We should bring this to a close. There are a few comments in the chat, which I encourage you to read. Have we left out anything really important, Mary, that we should have touched on? I don't think we have. I think we've sort of covered a few bits. Of course, there were other topics that came up, but we've sort of covered some important ones. So,
I just hope I wasn't too negative. I realised I was quite direct about some of the things that perhaps could be done slightly differently, but overall it was a great experience. It's really how we can actually build on
what I asked you to be. Yes. So no, not at all. We want to have a real sort of feedback, and because that'll help us improve for next year. Next year is the 75th. It'll be a sort of jubilee occasion. It will be held in Berlin, so we will have the same problem that they'll be sort of coming and going. But yeah, we'll try and cope with that. I'll end with a rather different remark. I'll pick up something that you said at the very beginning, Julie. You said that this was your first grown-up Königswinter. Officials in both the FCDO and the German Auswärtiges Amt always tend to think it's a senior citizens Königswinter. So being told it's a grown-up Königswinter is a big relief, of course, you know. So, of course, we try to tell them that we need to have new people each time, which we do, but we also need a sort of Königswinter community to sort of keep the ball rolling. Thank you both very, very much for giving us your time and for telling us what you felt about it. Thank you all for attending this. And as it's the last event this year, I can end by wishing you all a happy Christmas, happy New Year, and see you all at one of our next events in the new year, and hope to see you, Wiebke and Julie, at our next Königswinter again. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Gute Besserung.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gute Besserung. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.